So here we have Vladimir Solovyev's show on Russia One, which is just a bastion of Russian propaganda, and his panel standing here ready to talk about some very weird things as they discuss the sex lives of Americans as well as just an instantaneous transition into nuclear weapons discussion. But before I get started, I want to move my head here because this dude's picking his nose on national television. There you go, bud. There you go. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and get started here.
Американская любовь признает только один вид физической любви, который называется БДСМ. Я не знаю, можно это слово произносить в федеральном эфире, но Америка умеет только так. Только садизм, только завязать, связать, рот кляпом заткнуть и терпи, что называется.
Okay, so obviously that's ridiculous. I mean, yes, people in America, especially consenting adults, they have their various things that they would like to do when they're physical in their relationships. And there's nothing wrong with that. Clearly, Russia has some sort of hang up with those types of things. And I just have never seen one culture be so obsessed with what another culture does than what I've seen with Russia's obsession with America. I mean, now they're talking about how Americans have sex. Who cares? As long as no one's getting hurt, who cares? And that's the point. Russia in public will beat their chest and say, we're proud of the good old-fashioned missionary sex. And so what? But in private, or when they're in Ukraine and their soldiers are raping people, they have no problem with their sadistic ways and binding and gagging women as they do that. So apparently, Russia is totally cool with sex as long as it's good old-fashioned missionary or you're raping your enemies, because that's just how disgusting that culture really can be. Anyways, we'll continue on. Absolute cavemen, nuke on their skull. Unbelievable.
Всякие варианты. Мне убеждали, что это не так. Я тут немножко на другой передаче тоже на канале говорю, хорошо, вот вы все рассказываете. А вы понимаете, что такое снаряд 152 в ядерном снаряжении? Нет. А сколько он поражает? А какой зона поражения? А сколько, в зависимости от ветра, это будет разноситься? А что такое наземный воздушный взрыв? И когда вот эти друзья, которые мне там, наши коллеги говорят, что а мы не знаем, а как вообще про это рассуждаете, если вы там бельмес не понимаете?
So I'm not entirely sure what the angle is here. I didn't see the original show he brought this up, but I don't know if he's telling the other panel members on a previous show that the 152 millimeter nuclear artillery shell is not a viable option because it came up on the show, or he is advocating for using such a shell in Ukraine because he's previously advocated for using nuclear weapons. The reality is this is a non-issue because nuclear artillery hasn't been a viable thing on the battlefield, I don't know, for 60 years maybe. They originally were built by the United States and Russia in the 1960s for a tactical capability, but since then missiles and rockets have become far more accurate and more capable at long-range delivery of nuclear weapons. I mean, the 152 millimeter shell that would be fired out of a self-propelled gun on the battlefield can only go 18 kilometers. So it's already outranged by pretty much all artillery on the battlefield on both sides. So it would put itself at a pretty tactically precarious position to just be sitting there with nuclear weapons in its holding systems ready to fire, potentially taking indirect fire from US-made 777s or HIMARS or something like that. That being said, it doesn't even matter because the last nuclear shells were decommissioned 23 years ago. And if they held on to any and didn't make any new ones, they aren't going to work, or if they did work, it'd be very dangerous to handle because the shelf life of these artillery shells is 10 to 15 years. And that is largely why Russia decommissioned them, is because they weren't making any new ones and the shelf life of the ones they had expired. So unless they have some stored away somewhere and they're willing to roll the dice on a nuclear artillery shell that is 8 years past its expiration date, they're not going to use these. It doesn't make any sense. So I don't even know why this gentleman or any other panel member is talking about let's use 152 millimeter nuclear artillery shells as if it's the 1960s. But then again, they're using equipment from the 1960s already, so maybe they're just that dumb.
Поэтому сегодня с определенной стратегической инициативой нашей, она железно среди нашей, и тем успехом, который есть, я очень хочу, чтобы мы видели будущее, чтобы мы планировали за горизонт, чтобы мы понимали, что будет через год, 3, 5 и 10 лет. Вот в этой парадигме жестко к этому шли. Победим 100%. А где? Везде. Везде. И дело далеко не в Украине. Везде. Россия была, есть и будет великой державой, способной что? Нести, как вы сейчас будете сказать, мир. Ключевое слово мир. Спокойствие. Мир, спокойствие, но мы должны сделать выводы, чтобы когда-то в 45-м до конца не додавили. Сегодня мы должны додавить так, чтобы больше этой угрозы никогда и беды для нашей страны не было.
Never in the history of Russian ever have they brought peace and calm to anything. Period. That is nonsense. And it's kind of interesting where they talk about they will win everywhere. I wonder if China is interested to hear that Russia is going to win everywhere, because Russia and China have had border disputes. They've had them in the last century. So does that mean that Russia thinks that it can just take whatever it wants from anyone? He flat out said this is not just about Ukraine. And I've said this many times before. This is not just about Ukraine. The fact that they are so inept and pathetic that they're bottled up in Ukraine doesn't mean they didn't have ambitions to go further than Ukraine. They absolutely would love to take Georgia and Moldova and then Poland, Romania, the Baltics. All of those, the last ones that I said, NATO nations, absolutely. But they truly thought, and I've said this many times, they truly thought that NATO would be indifferent to their advances in Ukraine. And that's why they did it. And they, just like, because the NATO was largely indifferent when it came to Crimea. So they were going to probably test the waters after Ukraine, assuming they were going to be successful, which thankfully they aren't. So they've kind of been stopped in their tracks, but they were going to test the waters in the Baltic nations. They were going to see if NATO would come to the rescue of what would largely be considered smaller nations in the alliance, such as Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, so that they can test the waters on NATO's resolve. And if that went their way, they absolutely would have tried to move on Poland or Romania. Thankfully, they've shown that they're terrible at everything, so that's not going to be the case anytime soon, even if they wanted to. But the reality is Russia has aspirations, and you see it right here, of absolute global domination on a level that even the United States hasn't achieved, nor even wants to achieve. If that means that they win 100% everywhere, that includes China. That includes India. And don't think for one second that China and India don't recognize that. They're aware of Russia's absolutely adventuristic and imperialistic ambitions, and that's why China puts a military on their border with Russia because of that. So I just wanted to point that out, that this never was going to stop in Ukraine unless we stopped it in Ukraine. Russia wants to be as big as the old Soviet Union, and has even said that they would want to go all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, which means Germany, France, Spain, etc. That's just the way they present it. If that's how they truly feel, doesn't matter. We have to take it seriously. And I just don't think people in America or in other countries are taking it seriously enough at this point.